1 in 10 people worldwide used ChatGPT this week. Not this year, this week. No technology in history has spread this fast, not even the internet. So, what is everybody actually doing with AI? The three big rival labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google, have each studied millions of conversations with their own products, and now they're publishing a bunch of studies about it. I had a front row seat because I helped write one of the papers, and I've closely read the others, so you don't have to. The reassuring part is that AI is right now more likely to be a helpful assistant than a job replacement or a killer robot. The less reassuring part is that chatbots, helpful as they are, may already be yesterday's technology. Hi everyone, welcome to the Context Window. This week, I want to give you a guided tour through the major research reports released by the three frontier AI labs. That's OpenAI, Anthropic, and Google. These labs are sharing a lot of data and insights about AI usage around the world, how people are using their products at work and at home, and how usage is changing as AI becomes more broadly available and as agentic tools become an increasingly important part of the AI landscape. The thing is, it's almost too much data. Every lab has released multiple reports over the past year, sometimes as academic papers, sometimes as online data visualizations or DIY tools. Some of them focus on chatbots only. Some of them include enterprise usage and APIs. The samples and definitions change over time. The labs also have conflicting incentives. They want people to know about the rapid growth of AI because it's good for business. And to be fair, a lot of people who work at these labs are genuinely oriented toward research and knowledge production, and they genuinely care about making the information public so that policymakers and the public can be better informed. I know many of them, and I think their motives are mostly pure. On the other hand, these data are commercially sensitive, which means that the reports reveal plenty about how people use each product, but very little in the way of straightforward comparisons that would allow us, for example, to measure how the consumer and enterprise market shares of each product have changed over time. That is, who's winning the AI race. But I'm going to try to make my best guess at that anyway, so stay tuned. Today, you will hear my take on the research reports put out by all three labs, what's similar, what's different, and where I think it's all going. But first, a disclosure. I worked with researchers at OpenAI to publish one of these papers, which is called How People Use ChatGPT. I started working on the project a year and a half ago before I became dean. Other than signing a non-disclosure agreement that allowed me to view internally sensitive information, I have no formal employment or contracting relationship with OpenAI, and I have not been paid any money by them or by any other AI lab for that matter. I have colleagues and friends at all three labs, and I think there's great work coming out of all of them. But ultimately, my only goal here is to build a better public understanding of AI and personal understanding of AI, and to understand how it might affect the world. I'm not playing favorites. Okay, so let's go through them one by one. Nearly a year ago now, we published the paper I just mentioned, How People Use ChatGPT, which takes a comprehensive look at the growth of consumer ChatGPT. It doesn't include business or enterprise use of ChatGPT, and it also doesn't include APIs. In case you're wondering, API stands for Application Programming Interface. Think of an API like a bridge between the OpenAI server, which contains ChatGPT itself, and customers who want to use it. Software developers and other repeat customers tend to rely on the API rather than chat or other interfaces because you can write software that automatically calls on it rather than always having to type into a chat window. It's like an easy access fast lane for power users. The paper also doesn't cover usage through codecs and other more recently developed products. It's really just the chat in ChatGPT. After we released our paper, OpenAI developed a public website called Signals that updates our analyses every month and includes some additional information not in the paper, like state-level variation. The Signals website also includes some very basic information about enterprise usage, which they call B2B, or business-to-business signals. They've also very recently put out a paper that studies Codex, OpenAI's relatively new agentic encoding work platform and competitor to Claude Code. More on that later. Next up is Anthropic. In February 2025, researchers at Anthropic released a paper as part of a larger initiative they are calling the Anthropic Economic Index. This paper analyzed a dataset of about 1 million Claude conversations on their free and pro plans, no Claude Code or API usage, similar to our ChatGPT paper. They were particularly interested in work, so they developed a method to map the content of each conversation to concrete job tasks. They got the job tasks from a dataset called ONET. which was developed by the US Department of Labor. ONET develops a taxonomy of job tasks by surveying workers and managers and expert observers to basically figure out, what do people do all day? For example, according to ONET, my occupation code is 25-1063, economics teachers, post-secondary. And the top job tasks for that occupation are prepare and deliver lectures to undergraduate or graduate students on topics such as econometrics, price theory, and macroeconomics, number one. Number two, prepare course materials such as syllabi, homework assignments, and handouts. Number three, conduct research in a particular field of knowledge and publish findings in professional journals, books, or electronic media. Number four, record podcasts in my office, post on Twitter all day, and always read the comments section. Just kidding about that last one. Sort of. Anyway, there are 22 tasks listed, and I only gave you the top three. And they include sensible things like evaluating and grading student work, initiating and facilitating classroom discussion, writing grant proposals, other things like that. If you click on each task on the ONET website, you will see that many of them are also listed for other occupations. And each task gets an intensity or an importance score, which is meant to indicate how critical it is to that particular job. So the Anthropic folks basically fed the ONET task taxonomy into a Claude prompt and directed it to examine the content of people's conversations and pick the most closely related task. So for example, did this conversation seem like Deming was using Claude to make some lecture slides for a class? If so, assign it to that task, etc. And we did something similar with ONET in our ChatGPT paper, more on that in a moment. Anthropic also classified Claude conversations according to whether people were using it to automate workflows or to augment something they were doing outside the model, for example, learning a new concept or brainstorming. Anthropic has since released a bunch of follow-on papers and reports. Updates to the index in September 2025 and January 2026 looked at how the task shares changed, spoiler alert, not that much, and how Claude usage varied by country and region within the US. They also began to study API usage, which turns out to be much more work-based than Claude chatbot conversations. Not too surprising. And they attempted to classify work tasks along other dimensions, like how long it would take a person to do it, the expertise requirements of the task, how much autonomy the user gave Claude, and whether the model successfully completed the task. These are very subjective judgments. You're asking an LLM to look at a conversation between a person and a chatbot and ask whether that conversation was expert, whether it was successful. How do you know whether the LLM was right in its judgment? Hold that thought. Finally, last week, which, if you're beaming in from the future, binge watching the context window from your Mars orbiting space pod, was July 2026, Google released its Activity, Task, Landscape, and Adoption Study, or ATLAS, if you like tortured abbreviations. ATLAS studies about 15 million human AI interactions across the Gemini app, the Gemini API, and Google's AI mode, which is underneath a Google search query result that feeds your question directly to a chatbot. Notably, the paper does not include the automatic answer that comes up at the top of your Google search results these days called the AI overview, but perhaps they will in the future. Okay, so each frontier lab has released one or more research papers about how people are using their products. Before I tell you what I think are the main highlights from those papers, a few bits of important context. First, how do they protect user privacy? People reveal all kinds of intimate personal information to chatbots. If you don't believe me, ask a friend whether they will open their phone and share their last 10 chats with you. Nobody wants researchers digging through their chat logs, I assure you. All three labs are very careful to protect user privacy, primarily through the use of automated classifiers, which are designed so researchers never actually see the raw chats they are analyzing and categorizing. The approach was similar for all of them, but let me describe how it worked in the OpenAI case, since I have firsthand knowledge of it. The company identifies a dataset of conversations and before doing any analysis, scrubs it of identifying information. This includes easy steps like deleting account information and replacing it with a scrambled nonsense ID, like instead of David Deming, I get an ID number like, 8675309. And harder steps like writing an LLM classifier that searches through your chat history and deletes anything that identifies you, even incidentally. For example, if you ask it to edit your resume and it has your name on it, or you give me directions for my home address. All of this personal information deletion happens at the front end before researchers ever touch it. Even then, we never see the chat logs. Instead, the data are kept in a separate server, and you analyze it by writing a prompt for an internal model. And you say to it, based on this prompt, decide whether each conversation in the dataset is related to paid work, or assign it to the closest ONET task, or whatever. Then it runs on the walled off user chat logs, and we never see the actual text. We just get the values like work-related or not work-related returned to us. So that raises the question, how do we know that the message classifications are accurate? There's no ground truth, meaning we can't ask the user what they were actually trying to accomplish with the chatbot's assistance. Different prompts give different answers in a way that's not always obvious. For example, when we asked the model to guess whether a user query was related to paid work, we got different answers than just whether it was related to work. It was hard to say why without looking at the chat logs, but we think it had to do with schoolwork, which is work, but not usually paid work. And there are 1,000 examples like this. The details really matter. So our solution was to compare the model's classifications to human judgment calls. But again, we didn't want to look at people's private chat logs. So we ran our message classifiers on something called WildChat, which is a public data source of 1 million real ChatGPT conversations. We also asked some people to classify a subset of messages, and then we study the match between human ratings and AI ratings on those public messages. Agreement between human and model ratings of whether a message was work-related was 0.83 on a measure called Cohen's kappa, higher, believe it or not, than the agreement among the human raters themselves. Agreement was lower for the harder judgments with many categories, so we read these results as broad patterns, not precise counts. We wrote up all the details in a long appendix. The other two papers followed similar approaches. Anthropic had the model do the classification first, and then asked human raters whether the labels it assigned were acceptable. Google created synthetic conversations rather than using WildChat, and then also did some more limited human validation. All were reasonable approaches, in my view. The third important bit of context before we get to the good stuff is that none of these papers can credibly compare users to non-users, and they have only very limited information about user demographics and characteristics like income and education. They also can't tell you much about people switching across models and interfaces. Like, I use all 3 of the frontier models at different times and for different things. And so your internal data isn't going to paint a detailed picture like that. So if you want to understand how AI usage differs across groups, or study inequality in access to AI, or study model switching, you should look elsewhere. For example, at survey data. Okay, so in my view, across all these reports, there are 4 main takeaways. Number 1, consumer AI usage has grown faster than any technology in human history. As of early 2026, consumer ChatGPT had about 900 million unique weekly active users. There are 8.3 billion people in the world. That means that more than 10% of the global population uses ChatGPT at least once a week. The other labs haven't released data that is exactly comparable, but we do know that the Gemini app has 950 million monthly active users as of July 2026. That doesn't include AI mode or AI overviews. Anthropic hasn't published similar data, but according to the market intelligence firm Sensor Tower, which combines its own survey research with app downloads and other public information, they think Claude had about 245 million monthly active users as of May 2026. Of course, many of the people who use ChatGPT are also using Claude and Gemini, so you can't just add those 3 numbers up. And some of the counts are weekly and some are monthly. But I think it's safe to say that somewhere between 10 and 20% of the world's population are regularly using chatbots at home and at work. And none of these estimates include businesses or API usage or agentic AI programs. So let's just step back on this for a minute. ChatGPT came out less than 4 years ago, and now 1 in every 10 people in the entire world is using it. That's astonishing, and there simply is no precedent for it. I've been fielding a survey since 2024 where we track what share of US working age adults are using generative AI. We designed our survey to mimic something called the Current Population Survey, or the CPS, which is a big government survey that is the source of monthly employment figures that are released on the first Friday of every month. It typically makes news headlines and it moves markets. In the past, the CPS added supplements to its monthly surveys that measured the spread of new technologies like the personal computer and the internet. So we measured how fast all 3, PCs, the internet, and generative AI, have been adopted since they hit the mass market. It's a bit subjective, of course, when to date the beginning of a technology, but we chose 1981, when the IBM PC was released, as the beginning of the personal computer era, and 1995, when Netscape IPO'd and the NSFNet was made available to private companies, as the beginning of the internet era. And we chose 2022, with the release of ChatGPT, as the beginning of the generative AI era. In November 2025, 3 years after ChatGPT was released, 56% of US adults ages 18 to 64 used AI in the month prior to the survey, and 48% used it in the prior week. By comparison, 20% of people were using PCs in 1984, 3 years after the IBM PC came out. And 30% were using the internet by 1998, 3 years after the internet came out. 56% is greater than 30% and greater than 20%. So, by these standards, generative AI has spread significantly faster than PCs or the internet. Now, to be fair, these technologies build on each other. You can't have the internet without first inventing computers, and you can't use generative AI without having access to the internet. PCs are expensive pieces of hardware, and an AI subscription is free, or $20 a month for most people. Still, the spread of generative AI has been remarkably rapid. It took the internet and mobile phones more than a decade to reach the 10 to 20% global penetration rate that AI has achieved in 3 to 4 years. And now, the internet and phones are everywhere. It wouldn't even make sense to ask survey questions about them. So history tells us that this will soon be the case for AI too. Our quarterly AI survey will eventually seem quaint, like asking people whether they have an internet connection or a mailbox. Okay, takeaway number 2. Chatbot usage is very similar across platforms and consists mostly of information seeking, advice, and learning. Each of the research reports classifies conversation topics a little bit differently. In the ChatGPT paper, we group conversations into 24 different categories that fall into 7 broad topics, which we call seeking information, practical guidance, writing, technical help, multimedia, self-expression, and then other. Seeking information is the replacement for Google and other web search products. It's searching up facts and other specific information about products, recipes, things like that. Practical guidance is customized to the user. Teach me how to prove the central limit theorem, or develop a workout plan for a 47-year-old man who still thinks he has a 27-year-old body. Writing includes asking the chatbot to write for you, but also includes asking for critiques, edits, translation into different languages, and other manipulations of user text. Technical help is coding, data analysis, and math. Multimedia is image, video, and audio creation, and self-expression is chit-chat, therapy, relationship advice, role-playing. We found that about 75% of messages fell into the first 3 categories: practical guidance, seeking information, and writing. Self-expression is less than 10%, and coding itself is less than 5% of all queries. People are mostly using ChatGPT for advice and to help them solve practical, everyday problems. We also found that non-work usage is growing much faster than work usage. In 2024, half of all ChatGPT conversations were related to paid work, but now it's less than a third. And most of the work usage falls into the same categories, writing and practical guidance. The topics of Claude conversations were hard to figure out at first because their initial report, the Anthropic Economic Index, was narrowly focused on work. They mapped conversations to ONET tasks and then discarded conversations that couldn't be mapped to any job tasks. The paper appendix, which again I read so you didn't have to, indicates that up to 25% of conversations were unmapped. And to me, this feels like a lower bound on the share of non-work conversations because tasks like write me an email or tell me how to fix the dishwasher could sound work-related even if they aren't. In my opinion, that was a serious limitation of the original Anthropic Economic Index report. It told us a lot about how people use Claude for work, but very little about how much Claude usage is work in the first place. They've since addressed this concern, and there are some suggestive signs in follow-up reports that Claude chatbot use has gotten less work-related over time and swung more in the direction of information-seeking advice and learning. When they added API data in January 2026, they reported that less than half of chat conversations were work-related. In a March report, they state that 42% of Claude conversations are personal use rather than work or schoolwork, with the increase over time driven by shopping, sports, and home maintenance. However, overall, Anthropic users are more technically minded, and Anthropic as a company is much more focused on business use cases compared to OpenAI and Google. So their work usage is probably a bit higher than the other two. The Google Atlas report takes a different and quite interesting approach. Rather than mapping conversations to topics, they map them into daily activities using something called the American Time Use Survey. It's a government survey that asks people to fill out time diaries for their daily activities. The ATUS considers broad categories like work, education, socializing and leisure, household activities, personal care, traveling, shopping, etc. So the Atlas report classifies conversations into these daily activities. And they find that 26%, or more than 1 in 4 conversations, are related to socializing, relaxing, and leisure. Another 22% are related to personal and professional care, consumer purchases, and travel. 11% are related to household activities, that means chores, and 20% are related to education. Only 13.5%, or less than 1 in 7, are related to work. However, and here's the key point, most non-work conversations are about what they call productive household activities. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, that sounds like a term that only an economist could love. And you're right. A productive activity is something that you can, and ideally you'd like to, outsource to a third party. Cleaning, home repair and maintenance, other chores are obvious cases. Watching a movie, going out to dinner, not so much. And then there are some intermediate cases like cooking, shopping, and childcare. Some people like to outsource these activities, some don't. Your mileage may vary. Anyway, the Google Atlas paper breaks this down in a very interesting way. They compare the frequency of Google chat queries to the frequency of time use and ask whether AI seems to be more important in some aspects of life relative to the time spent on it. Very clever. For example, people spend about 4% of their time in education, but education is 20% of Gemini queries. In contrast, people spend 10% of their time eating and drinking, but only 1% of AI conversations are about eating and drinking. These comparisons give you a sense of which activities are most AI intensive relative to time spent, and perhaps a window into which activities people find most helpfully assisted by AI. And the biggest outliers here are education, which is more than 5x overrepresented, 20% versus 4%, personal care, consumer purchases, and government services, which is 20x more represented in AI conversations than in time usage. And they dig into that a little bit more and find that people are especially likely to use AI to help with what they call high-friction administrative tasks. That's like filling out paperwork in government forms, getting legal, medical, and financial advice in industries that are highly regulated and often keep 9 to 5, banker's hours, so to speak. And they also do some speculative but very clever back-of-the-envelope calculations on the potential value of time savings from AI usage, which I'll dig into more in a later pod. So the overall picture is that all 3 frontier AI models get used in similar ways. They are used to solve practical, everyday problems that may not be work-related, but are productive in the sense that you'd outsource them if you could. And so AI assistance saves you time and hassle. So far, almost all AI use overall is chatbot use, although agentic AI is growing rapidly. And that means that, at least for now, information-seeking advice and learning are the dominant use cases for generative AI. Okay, third point. Work usage of ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini is broad, but not particularly deep. Here's what I mean by that. AI is useful in an incredibly wide range of jobs. If you look at how the PC was adopted, for example, it was used a lot in computer jobs like programming, and also by secretaries and administrative assistants who were sitting next to the computer all day and using it for most of the work they previously did on typewriters, keeping files electronically. They used to go in file cabinets and things like that. So most professionals weren't using computers very much at all. Manual laborers and retail store workers definitely weren't using them at all. Computer usage changed a few jobs a lot, but most jobs, not at all. It was deep, but not broad. AI is not like that. Most people in management, business, and computer occupations use AI. That's not surprising. But more than half of doctors, teachers, lawyers, and other professionals use AI too. A third of blue-collar workers and a quarter of service sector workers say they use AI regularly on the job. It's everywhere. And yet, very few jobs have been fundamentally reimagined or reorganized around AI. Instead, people are using it to answer questions, fill in gaps, and get advice about tricky situations. It's like a helpful assistant, not even a coworker, much less a wholesale replacement for anyone. In our ChatGPT paper, we classified work-related messages using ONet, and we found that 7 work activities accounted for nearly 80% of all usage. And those 7 were documenting and recording information, thinking creatively, making decisions and solving problems, getting information, interpreting the meaning of information, working with computers, and providing consultation and advice. These are the names of the ONet tasks. And then we asked, what are the top tasks in different occupations? In other words, what does the top 7 look like for coders? What does it look like for doctors, for teachers, for food service workers, for policemen? And we found that the top 7 overall, the ones I just mentioned, were almost universally the top 7 within every single occupation group. You might think that training and teaching, which is another ONet task, would be the top task for educators, or that performing administrative activities, another ONet task, would be at the top of the list for administrative assistants. But we didn't find that. Instead, we had the same top 7 everywhere. And I would group them really into 2 broad categories. Information manipulation, meaning writing or summarizing, critiquing, editing, categorizing, and decision support, meaning getting advice and different perspectives about how to handle complicated situations in work and in life. Information manipulation and decision support are useful in every single job, but they are too shallow by themselves to replace any single job completely. And the Google Atlas paper reached a similar conclusion. They count all the job tasks in their data for which they observe people using Gemini to perform or help them. Then they map the coverage of those tasks across occupations to figure out how saturated each job is in terms of AI capabilities. And they find that about 30% of jobs have 0 saturation, meaning none of the tasks are ever AI assisted. Like one example would be stocking shelves. You're not using AI for any aspects of that job. Among the remaining 70% of jobs where AI is at least minimally useful in one job task, the median saturation share, meaning the share of tasks where AI is useful, was only 21%. And only 3% of jobs had task saturation levels above 75%. In other words, AI is minimally useful in 70% of jobs, a very high share, but only marginally useful in most of them, and doesn't replace any of them. And it makes sense when you think about it. AI chatbots serve a broadly useful function, but they don't exist in the physical world, which makes it hard for them to do stuff. That puts a limit on delegation of work, at least for now. But they are incredibly accessible sources of information manipulation and decision support. They are tireless assistants with encyclopedic knowledge and infinite patience. And that brings me to the 4th and final takeaway. When studying how AI gets used, the medium is the message. ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini are, to my mind, shockingly similar. People have different preferences about which ones they like to use better, but it's the narcissism of small differences, really. All 3 are basically used in the same way by the same kinds of people, even though they were developed independently by profit-seeking companies that jealously guard their intellectual property and are basically trying to kill each other every day out there in the market. It's Coke and Pepsi and maybe Dr. Pepper. I won't say which is which. The chatbot medium is optimized for assistance, and that's generally how people use it, regardless of which lab they like better. It is difficult to imagine chatbots replacing people at work, with the possible exception of online customer service agents or chatbot girlfriends like Samantha from the movie Her. So if your AI knowledge is current, as of a year ago, you could be a bit blasé about the whole AI destroying jobs narrative. But agentic AI platforms like Claude Code and Codex turn the medium around. Rather than the unit of work being a conversation, it's a delegated workflow. You tell an agent to go do something, give it some parameters and guardrails, and then it goes to work. In one of their recent reports, Anthropic compared interactions related to coding within their Claude chatbot to similar coding tasks within Claude Code, their agentic platform. And they classified 49% of the chatbot interactions as autonomous, compared to 79% of Claude Code interactions. Same topic, different medium. The main difference is that the medium gives AI agents more leeway to keep working on a problem even after they get stymied, whereas chatbot interactions are much more serve and return. The report found that a typical instruction generated roughly 10 autonomous actions in Claude code, sometimes more than 100. People with expertise in the task domain, interestingly, not coding skill per se, but expertise, substantive expertise, were better at generating longer action chains when using Claude code, perhaps because they could foresee issues that might stand in the way of an agent. Here's one simple example. Many public websites grant access to data, but require an API key, sort of like a password. If you ask Claude Code or Codex to go find some data and analyze it, but you don't help it obtain an API key, it can easily get stuck. It also gets stuck on human-in-the-loop safeguards like two-factor authentication. Vague instructions like find a convenient hotel also give agents a lot of trouble, because how does it know your definition of convenient? Being specific about what you want, anticipating issues, and just generally being a good manager matters just as much with agents as it does with humans. So to be clear, AI agents mostly live within the confines of the internet for now, which does limit their usefulness in many jobs. But you can get a lot of work done and cause a lot of trouble on the internet. I haven't seen any comprehensive data on the growth in agentic AI usage, but my best guess is it's been extremely rapid. Weekly active users on OpenAI's Codex increased more than 5x between January and June of 2026. Claude Code had more than 500 million of annualized revenue in September 2025, but more than 2.5 billion in February 2026. That's a 5x increase in 5 months. Agentic AI is growing fast as a share of customers, but it's growing even faster as a share of total usage. According to a recent paper about Codex usage by OpenAI researchers, about 1/6 of OpenAI business customers use Codex at all, only 1/6, but it accounts for 63% of all usage as measured by output tokens across Codex and ChatGPT. Less than 1% of personal users are on Codex, but it accounts for 1/6 of their tokens. That's because delegation to agents is much more token intensive. They're out there doing stuff, not just answering questions. The paper also notes that more than 25% of OpenAI employees who use Codex are managing 5 or more agents in parallel in any given week. I guess we're all managers now. My sense is that the agentic AI revolution is going to be a very big deal for work, much bigger than chatbots like ChatGPT, Claude, and Gemini. Coding is a very clear use case, but it remains to be seen how broadly useful agents can be as they spread throughout the economy. People at the AI labs know this, but agent usage is still pretty specialized, and I don't think people fully understand how different it will look compared to chatbot usage. Because everyone was predicting the end of work when ChatGPT came out, there's a boy who cried wolf temptation to think that nothing much will change, and I think that's a mistake. Agents are a big deal, and they're just getting started. I have many more thoughts on this topic, but I'd rather react to data than speculate irresponsibly, so I'm going to save it for a later podcast. Okay, so let's sum up here. Again, I read all these Frontier Lab AI papers, so you didn't have to. And here's what I learned. First, consumer AI has grown faster than any technology in human history. Love it or hate it, it's here to stay, and AI is going to be second nature for all of us very soon. Second, across all 3 Frontier AI models, the dominant use cases are information seeking, advice, and learning. People use AI for all kinds of things, but mostly to solve practical, everyday problems in their lives. Third, work usage is broad, but not deep. AI chatbots help you obtain and analyze information and make better decisions, but they don't plug into workflows in a way that lets you take your hands off the wheel. And AI usage is extremely similar across quite different jobs, which I at least found very surprising. Fourth, the medium is the message. Chatbots are optimized to be helpful assistants, and that's mostly all they are. AI agents are optimized for delegation. We've already seen huge impacts on software, with the labs declaring that humans are now doing a vanishingly small share of code writing at these companies, but we are still figuring out what that means for the non-software economy. Coding is a very self-contained and easily verified task. The critical question for the future is how easy will it be to generalize agentic AI to domains where success is harder to judge, and you don't always know exactly what you want. I hope you enjoyed this primer on how people are using AI. If you want to read the papers, there are tons of links for you in show notes. So feel free to go nuts with it. See you next time.